My name is Judge Judy, and in all my years on the bench, I have learned something that never changes. People will tell you exactly who they are when money enters the conversation. They may hide it for years behind smiles, handshakes, holiday dinners, and carefully chosen words. But the moment dollar becomes more important than decency, the mask falls. And when that mask falls in my courtroom, there is nowhere left to hide. The case before me that morning looked simple on paper. Landlord versus tenant, a rent dispute, a notice to vacate. Just another stack of documents among hundreds that pass through courtrooms every day. But then I saw the date. 3 days. 3 days after a funeral. 3 days after a woman buried the man she had spent 47 years loving. 3 days after she stood beside a grave and said goodbye to the only person who had shared every struggle, every victory, every fear, and every dream of her adult life. That was when I knew this was not about rent. This was about character. The plaintiff sat confidently at one table, a successful property owner in his late 50s, expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive smile, the kind of smile that appears when someone believes money makes them untouchable. Across from him sat the defendant, a 79-year-old widow, small frame, shaking hands, eyes that looked exhausted, not angry, not bitter, just tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying grief every minute of every day. I looked at her file. For 22 years, she had lived in the same apartment. 22 years. Never missed a rent payment, never caused a complaint, never damaged property, never created trouble. 22 years of reliability. Then her husband died. And 3 days later, the landlord raised her rent by almost 40%. 40%. I looked at the landlord. Did you issue this increase 3 days after her husband's funeral? He adjusted his tie. Technically, yes. Technically, people love that word. They use it when morality is inconvenient. They use it when decency becomes expensive. They use it when they know they are wrong, but hope legality will save them. Technically, I leaned forward. Was it 3 days after the funeral? Yes. The courtroom became quiet, not because people were surprised, because they were waiting to hear how someone explains a decision like that. The landlord smiled. The market changed. The market changed. Interesting. The market apparently waited until exactly 3 days after a funeral to make its move. What remarkable timing. I asked another question. Had you planned the increase before her husband died? He hesitated. A dangerous thing to do in my courtroom. Truth moves quickly. Lies need time. Well, that one word told me more than an entire testimony. Answer the question. Yes. So you planned it earlier? Yes. Then why not send it earlier? Silence. The courtroom watched. The widow lowered her eyes. I have seen that look before. It is the look of someone expecting disappointment. Someone who has spent weeks believing nobody cares. Someone who thinks the world has already decided her value. The landlord finally answered. It wasn't personal. Another phrase people use when something is absolutely personal. I picked up a document, a copy of the funeral notice, attached to an email sent by the widow's daughter. The family informed the landlord of the death. They informed him about funeral arrangements. They informed him about the emotional situation. And less than 72 hours later, he sent the rent increase. I held up the paper. You knew exactly what this family was going through. I run a business. There it was, the shield, the excuse, the justification. Business. As if business and humanity are enemies. As if compassion automatically destroys profit. As if basic decency causes financial collapse. I have met successful people, very successful people, people worth millions, some worth hundreds of millions. And do you know something? The most successful among them usually understand timing. They understand relationships. They understand reputation. Because real success is not measured by how much you can take from people. It is measured by how much trust you earn. The widow finally spoke. Her voice barely reached the microphone, My husband handled everything. The courtroom became even quieter, she continued. I don't understand legal papers. She swallowed hard. He always took care of those things. That sentence hit the room differently because everyone understood what she meant. She wasn't just talking about rent. She wasn't just talking about paperwork. She was talking about loss. For 47 years, someone stood beside her. Then suddenly that person was gone. And before she even learned how to live alone, someone handed her another burden, another fear, another problem, another reminder that the world keeps moving even when your heart has stopped. The landlord rolled his eyes, a tiny movement. But I noticed everything. I asked him a simple question. Have you ever lost a spouse? No. Have you ever planned a funeral? No. Have you ever spent 47 years with someone? No. Then I looked directly at him. So perhaps you should be careful pretending you understand what she was experiencing. Silence. The uncomfortable kind, the truthful kind, the kind people cannot escape. Then something unexpected happened. The widow reached into her purse. Slowly, carefully, she removed a photograph, an old photograph, edges worn from time. A picture of her and her husband standing in front of the apartment building 20 years earlier, smiling, young compared to now, hopeful, proud. She held it tightly. He loved that apartment. Those 5 words carried more weight than every legal argument presented that day. Because home is never just walls. Home is memory. Home is laughter. Home is birthdays. Home is anniversaries. Home is ordinary moments that become priceless once the people involved are gone. The landlord saw a rental unit. She saw a life. And that difference changed everything. I reviewed more documents, payment records, maintenance requests, lease history. Something caught my attention. 22 years. 22 years of rent, hundreds of payments, thousands upon thousands of dollars. The widow had generated enormous income for this property owner over 2 decades. Reliable, consistent, predictable, exactly the type of tenant landlords dream about. Yet the moment she became vulnerable, the relationship changed. That tells you everything, not about business, about character. Because character is revealed by how you treat people who cannot fight back, how you treat people when there is no audience, how you treat people when kindness is optional. And this landlord had made his choice. He chose profit, he chose timing, he chose pressure. But the story was far from over, because buried deep inside the evidence was a detail nobody expected, a detail that would completely change the direction of the hearing. And when I discovered it, I stopped everything. I stopped the testimony. I stopped the arguments. I stopped the hearing itself, because suddenly this was no longer a simple rent dispute. It had become something much bigger. And what happened next left the entire courtroom speechless. I stopped the hearing because something in the paperwork didn't make sense. After years on the bench, you develop instincts. Documents speak. Dates speak. Signatures speak. Sometimes they tell a story very different from the one people are trying to tell in court. I looked again at the stack of papers submitted by the landlord. There it was, a redevelopment proposal, buried deep inside the evidence. Not highlighted, not mentioned, not discussed, almost as if someone hoped nobody would notice. I picked it up. The landlord immediately shifted in his seat. That told me everything. People don't become nervous because of harmless documents. They become nervous because of dangerous truths. I held up the paper. What is this? The landlord stared at it. His attorney suddenly looked interested in the ceiling. A remarkable phenomenon in courtrooms. When bad evidence appears, attorneys often become fascinated by architecture. I asked again, "What is this document?" Finally, he answered, "It's a future development proposal." Future development proposal. Interesting. Luxury apartments, higher income tenants, building renovations, projected rent increases, estimated completion date. And then I found the line that changed everything. Current long-term tenants identified for gradual removal. I looked up. The courtroom was silent. The widow looked confused. The landlord looked worried. And for the first time all morning, I believed we were getting close to the truth. So this rent increase wasn't really about market conditions. Silence. So this wasn't really about inflation. More silence. This was about getting rid of existing tenants. His face changed. The confident smile disappeared, because confidence survives many things. It does not survive evidence. The courtroom could feel it. That moment when a carefully constructed story begins collapsing under its own weight. I continued reading. Several units were marked for turnover. Several elderly tenants. Several long-term residents. People who had spent decades building lives inside that property. People who trusted they would be treated fairly. People who suddenly became obstacles to a business plan. I looked directly at the landlord. You wanted her out. No. I held up the document. The paper disagrees with you. I was exploring options. Another favorite phrase. Humans create endless vocabulary for avoiding responsibility. Exploring options. Considering alternatives. Evaluating possibilities, strategic restructuring. The language changes. The intention remains the same. I turned toward the widow. Did you know about this? She shook her head. No, of course she didn't. For weeks, she believed she was being punished by circumstances. She believed the world had become more expensive. She believed she had somehow become unlucky. The truth was worse. She had become inconvenient. And there is something particularly cruel about treating human beings as inconveniences, especially people who spent decades doing everything right. The landlord suddenly became defensive. I have rights as a property owner. I nodded. Absolutely. That surprised him. People assume judges only see one side. Good judges don't. Rights matter. Property rights matter. Contracts matter. Business matters. But rights do not erase his responsibility. Having the legal ability to do something does not automatically make it the right thing to do. That distinction is where character lives. I asked another question. When did you first begin planning this redevelopment? He gave me a date. I checked the document. The planning had started almost 8 months earlier. 8 months. The widow's husband had still been alive, still paying rent, still maintaining the apartment, still believing he and his wife would spend their remaining years there. I looked at the widow. Her eyes filled with tears, not because of the money, not because of the apartment, because she finally understood what had happened. The rent increase wasn't random. The timing wasn't accidental. She had been selected. Her grief had simply created an opportunity. And that realization hit harder than any financial loss. The courtroom remained perfectly quiet. Even spectators understood the significance. This wasn't merely a disagreement. This was a lesson about what happens when people begin viewing every relationship through the lens of profit, a lesson about what happens when efficiency replaces empathy, a lesson about what happens when numbers become more important than people. I looked again at the payment history. 22 years. Not one missed payment. Not one eviction notice. Not one major complaint. 22 years of reliability. If loyalty means anything, it should mean something then. If trust means anything, it should mean something then. If decency means anything, it should mean something then. The landlord crossed his arms. I didn't break any laws. Maybe, maybe not. Courtrooms deal with laws, but life deals with something larger: reputation, integrity, honor, the things no statute can manufacture, the things no contract can force, the things every human being must choose for themselves. I leaned forward. Do you know why people respect fairness? He didn't answer. Because fairness becomes most important when you don't have to be fair. The room was completely still. You had all the power. I pointed toward the widow. She had none. You had attorneys. She was planning a funeral. You had investment projections. She was learning how to live without her husband. and your first major decision after his death was to make her future even more uncertain. No response. There wasn't one, because some facts speak for themselves. I reviewed every remaining document, every notice, every communication, every email, every timeline. The conclusion became impossible to avoid. The rent increase had been strategically timed. The widow had been pressured. The redevelopment plan provided clear motivation. And the landlord's explanations grew weaker every time evidence appeared. Eventually, there was nothing left to discuss, only a decision left to make. I folded my hands. The courtroom waited. This is the moment people imagine when they think about judges. The verdict, the final words, the point where uncertainty ends. I looked first at the widow. For the first time all day, she met my eyes. Then I looked at the landlord. For the first time all day, he looked away. That told me more than either side's testimony. I delivered my ruling. Based upon the evidence presented, the timeline established, and the credibility issues demonstrated throughout these proceedings, judgment is entered in favor of the defendant. The courtroom exhaled, not loudly, just enough. The sound people make when justice feels possible. But I wasn't finished. I rarely am. I looked at the landlord one final time. Success is not measured by how much property you own. Silence. Success is measured by how you treat people when they are at their weakest. More silence. You viewed a grieving widow as a business problem. The words hung in the air, and that says far more about you than it ever will about her. The widow began crying quietly. Not the cry of defeat, the cry of relief. The cry that arrives when someone finally feels heard, when someone finally feels seen, when someone finally realizes they are not invisible. The landlord gathered his papers, slowly, without confidence, without the smile, without the certainty he carried into court. Because money can buy many things: property, influence, comfort, but it cannot buy respect. Respect must be earned. And on that day, respect belonged entirely to a 79-year-old widow who had endured loss with dignity. As the hearing ended, she picked up the photograph of her husband, the same photograph she had carried all morning. She smiled at it, a small smile, a quiet smile, the kind that says, "We made it," not because she won money, not because she won a case, because for one moment in one courtroom, truth mattered. And despite everything wrong in this world, that still matters. It always will.